Mark, before we start discussing the music in your opening season concert with the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra, you've been the orchestra's chief conductor now for, well, you're in your second season, so you've all got to know each other. What is the BSO's USP? What makes it special?
I think they all care to the same degree, which is a lot. But to have that sort of consistency of value, that consistency of pride, and I think it comes from being where we are. Everybody's made a decision to be in Poole in the southwest, and a very active decision to serve that community, and they take a great deal of pride and joy in being the orchestra for that part of the world. And so you sense that first and foremost it's about communicating to the audience rather than we're playing this for ourselves. And I love that. I find that very inspiring, that we're all there for the audience's experience of the music.
I'm always struck when I present digital concerts with the BSO that whatever is thrown at them, they're going to make the most of it and enjoy it to the hilt. Now, what are you throwing at them in the first concert? Because it's got the title, Standing Up for Truth, which I'm assuming is drawn from the last piece in the concert, Shostakovich's 10th Symphony.
That's what the title is for. Shostakovich stood up for truth at great personal cost to himself, but left us something incredibly inspirational for us to do the same. And we can talk about the specifics of why he wrote this piece and what it expresses, but fundamentally it is about holding on to that truth and not letting social, political pressures change who you are.
It was premiered about a few months after the death of Joseph Stalin, and Shostakovich himself did say, well, actually I wrote it all about Stalin. But other commentators have said, well, it's much more inward-looking than that. What's your take? Is it a bio piece?
It's not about Stalin, it's about living under Stalin or living under any type of dictatorship. And how does one deal with that? Shostakovich would write music in his head almost completely before he wrote it down. So we never really know. So dating his compositions is always quite difficult, because he certainly wrote it down and presented it to the world after Stalin had died, and he couldn't have done so prior to that, because the message is too overt, the message is too revolutionary he wouldn't have survived had Stalin still been alive. But when he actually wrote it, in terms of his compositional thought, is hard to pinpoint. But it is about terror, it's about loneliness, it's about anger, isolation. How do you deal with all these things? How do you stay true to who you are? How do you stay true to your friends when you're living in such oppressive society? It was the first piece of Shostakovich's I ever got to know. Actually, I got to know it through a recording made by the BSO. So I've always thought of this orchestra.
You're coming home with it,
well,
really,
I've always associated the musicians of in the 70s is when I would have heard it. The musicians of the orchestra with this piece, and the first time you hear a piece, one always remembers that. So there's a nice sort of personal connection to the piece. But it was the first piece of Shostakovich's I fell in love with. But the point is, it was through this piece that I understood about Stalin, and I understood the history of the Soviet Union, which in the 70s growing up was a bit not really discussed. We talked about the fight against Nazis, and we've talked about the fight against Hitler as children in the school, but Stalin wasn't really talked about. And it was only through Shostakovich that I discovered quite what was going on in that part of the world. The West sort of tolerated the Soviet Union. It suited the West to be tolerant of it at the time. And so history in school was very much focused on the Second World War. And I was devastated through Shostakovich to understand this world that he lived in.
So Shostakovich he couldn't leave the Soviet Union. He was stuck there, and he had to accommodate a reign of terror, really, which we now know it to be. But he did include some coded, covert messages of defiance and perhaps romance. Tell me about the third movement, because that's got two coded musical themes in it, hasn't it?
Absolutely. So if you spelt notes in the German way they discuss their notes, for the letters D-S-C-H, Dmitri Shostakovich, the first three letters, so his initials essentially D-S-C-H, S is E flat, C we know, and H is a B natural. So if you have D-S-C-H in the way the Germans speak about musical language, you get the notes D, E flat, C, B natural. And this four-note figure is unmistakable. Whether you articulate, when you're listening to it, whether you articulate it as his initials, you certainly hear it as a sort of signature, as an autograph, as a repetitive sense of identity.
And it's actually very menacing. I haven't got perfect pitch, but it's going da 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 da, and that's full of foreboding. Is that have I got that right?
I think the closeness together of the notes creates that tension for sure, and certainly when it's repeated, you sense you sense an enclosed world. And I think that's what Stalin was created. He created his terror by forcing people to stay enclosed, to stay within themselves. They couldn't really express themselves. They couldn't say, I think this, I think that. So they had to be very internal. And it just so happens that that musical description of his signature is very inward-looking and very intense. But in contrast to that, there's another theme that comes about, and this is slightly more disputed, as to what it means, but there's a horn call that comes 12 times, always exactly the same. And these notes spell out, similarly, notationally wise, the name Elmira. And we happen to know that Elmira was one of his students, who he was rather, well, I don't want to suggest how much he was in love with her, but he wrote her a lot of letters, put it that way. And she was a symbol of youth, of optimism. But the tune also sounds like the opening of Mahler's The Song of the Earth, which is exactly the same notes, exactly the same melody. And that piece is about is optimistic for the world, that the world will always renew itself. There's an eternity in The Song of the Earth that expresses hope. So for me, this horn call, whether it's this young lady or it's the world's eternal renewal, it's a symbol of hope. And for Shostakovich, that force, whether you identify it as her or something bigger than that, doesn't matter. What it is something we can aspire to, and it sort of triumphs in the third movement for briefly, and then collapses in on itself again, and you realize, well, it is there, but it's not a given that it will survive.
Now you're painting a picture of three very strong themes. The overarching one of describing life under Stalin, the inward-looking but slightly defiant signature of Dmitri Shostakovich, and the openness implied by Elmira. If somebody is listening to this symphony, coming to it for the first time, and doesn't know any of that, will they enjoy it much less, or what else is there to enjoy? And, well, enjoy is perhaps the wrong word. What else is there about the symphony that really makes it captivating if you don't know any of that?
I don't think you need to know that, because I think it works on a subconscious basis, and whether you articulate it as being that specific meaning, I don't think matters. I do think you do sense the mania, and you do sense the optimism. There is one more element, though, which I think is crucial, which is the snare drum. And the snare drum has a huge role to play, particularly in the second movement, which is a sort of portrait of Stalin, or certainly a portrait of one's anger about him. And the snare drum is crucial, and it has a very repetitive figure, very typical snare drum sort of writing, that is clearly a machine at work. It's clearly the force of government, authority. And this keeps coming back into the symphony. And by the end of the symphony, you have Shostakovich's signature at the same time as Stalin's authority in the drum. And you sense these two forces, if you like, one for evil, one for good, to be simplistic about it, fighting it out. And what I find fascinating about the piece is it's unclear who wins. And every time I conduct the piece, and I've done it over 60 times actually, every time I conduct the piece, the ending feels slightly different to me. And that's not a decision I've made in advance. That's how the performance is evolving, as to whether you feel depressed because Stalin is still there, whether you feel optimistic because Shostakovich is still there, whether you feel probably realistic that the world is going to have both these things, and we cannot give in. That's the triumph of the piece, is not that Stalin is defeated, or evil is defeated, or dictatorship is defeated, but that it is not victorious either, because totalitarianism will never be total unless you let it. And they can take everything from you, they can take all the material things from your life, but if you don't give in your spirit, your determination to be who you are, then they'll never win.
That is going to be so exciting for us to listen to.
It is a thrilling experience, and as I say, to me it doesn't matter whether people are able to articulate the historical context. We wouldn't play this piece if it was simply a lecture on what it was like to live in 1953 under Stalin. Dictatorships exist all over the world. I mean, they exist domestically too, frankly. It's not just a political thing. How one holds on to hope and truth is up to us. And hearing this music, I think, inspires us to do that.
Well, nothing could follow that in a concert, and that work will indeed be the final work in your opening concert of the 25-26 season with the BSO. It's preceded by another Russian composer's work, a composer who, unlike Shostakovich, managed to leave his native land when revolution came in 1917. And that was also the year in which Rachmaninoff revisited his first youthful piano concerto and revised it extensively. He'd been very influenced by the model of Grieg's famous concerto, and then had come the second and third concertos, which were so popular that he thought, I guess, a need to revisit this youthful piece and make it a bit less Grieg, a bit more Rachmaninoff. But I looked it up, and I see that he wrote a note saying, it's really good now. All the youthful freshness is there, and it plays much more easily. But when I tell them in America, which is where he eventually settled, that I will play the first concerto, they do not protest. But I can see by their faces that they would prefer the second or the third. Well, the first concerto could have no finer advocate than Sir Stephen Hough, who will be the soloist in your performance. What do you like about this concerto? There's much more to it than just being a forerunner of the second or third, isn't there?
I think you've expressed it perfectly. So it was a very youthful piece initially, so we have all of that passion and all of that sort of carelessness in the best sense of the word, and openness. But because he revised it, having become so much more experienced through writing the second and third, we also have his artistry of experience. So it's the best of both worlds. It is unfettered emotion, but with incredible compositional clarity. And yes, people tend to gravitate to the pieces they know. The second and the third are wonderful. But I think the more music one hears, the more one loves what one hears. And so to be able to play the first, particularly with Stephen, who we've worked together for 30 years and done this piece together before, and he always gets to the heart of what the composer is. I've done so much different music with him, and yet it always sounds true to the composer in a way that is not as obvious as you might think in soloists. So to play this youthful piece with somebody who will give it the seriousness that it deserves is very special.
And the concert begins with a work by a composer who's very much with us. She's only in her early 30s, and she's making, I think, most exciting impact on the musical world. I really admire the music of Danny Howard. I think she's a hugely exciting talent, and you've chosen to celebrate her music in this coming season, opening with a piece called The Butterfly Effect, which is about the massive impact a small thing like the movement of a butterfly's wing can have. Tell me more about the piece.
I think when you listen to new music, you need something to latch onto. So what is this about? Why is this music being written? And many of us are familiar with the concept of the butterfly effect, the idea that a small thing can have huge consequences. And I think it's quite easy to imagine how that can be expressed in music, in pure music, that a little sound that you hear at the beginning can be developed, and over 10 or 12 minutes comes something much bigger. And so for an audience to come to a piece of music where they sort of are already given a bit of a helping hand as to, well, what is this music for? Why are we listening to this? It's helped, of course, that her music is very listenable to. It's wonderful sound, it's colours in the orchestra, it's very open textures, brilliance and lyricism and joy. So you couple that with a clear storytelling, if you like, and I think people will love it.